During the 5 years of a childless marriage, Nellie Mostyn had lived her life dedicated to the imagined ailments and literary aspirations of her husband. For the last 3 of those years, Christopher had been working on a definitive biography and lyrical review of an obscure Elizabethan poet. Morning after morning it had been Nellie's job to sit with her husband in his study, looking up references, copying out his notes, receiving his dictation, and rising at regular intervals to fetch him his tonic or his aspirin or his glass of hot water. In the afternoon she would take a drive with him, and was almost equally busy with adjusting one window of the car up and the other 2 inches down, with telling the chauffeur not to drive so fast or a shade faster, with rearranging the collar of Christopher's coat or shifting his hot water bottle. Sometimes, if it was not too warm or too cold, he got out to walk for half a mile, when she carried his woolen scarf in case the breeze turned chilly or the sun went behind the clouds. When he got back into the car, he would comment on their lovely walk and doze. Nellie's youth and vigour were always a tonic to him, and he was eager to get home and set to work again. One perfect spring afternoon on their drive, Nellie had had to frequently use the speaking tube to tell the chauffeur to go a shade faster, as Christopher wanted 2 clear hours for dictation between tea time and 7 o'clock. It was then that he always rested for half an hour, and if he fell asleep, it was Nellie's duty to wait 5 minutes and then wake him. During the drive, Christopher had requested the window right up, between telling Nellie that he had a surprise for her that night. After hurrying her because of the considerable draught, he then said that she would be excited by his surprise. On their return, tea was ready, and before 5 o'clock, Christopher, with his rug spread over his knees and his notes in front of him, had started to dictate, occasionally pausing to sip his hot water. They worked at the big table in his study, lined with books, and Christopher sat in a rocking chair by the fire when Nellie read back a finished section. Nellie took down his words automatically, while her mind dwelt on her joyless and lonely life. Not even did a neighbour visit due to Christopher's regimented routine, nor did they accept hospitality from others, partly due to his concerns about being served indigestible food. Of course, Nellie could not go out and leave him alone, but a kind of rebellion had been brewing in her, today's joyous sense of spring causing it to bubble afresh. The only outside person who entered this hermitage was Dr. Bernard Eves, who visited Christopher weekly and was usually summoned once or twice in between. The young man, a recent incumbent into the job, was cheerful and often congratulated his patient on his general soundness. After the examination, he interviewed Nellie and gave her the prescribed regime for the next week. Although few words of personal interest had passed between them, both were aware of a mutual attraction and kindling fire. Although Nellie's husband was not yet 50, his demeanour and appearance were rapidly ageing, and she suddenly shuddered with a qualm of repulsion at the sight of him. He had now dictated from the last of his written notes, as Nellie took down his words and paused for the next, then immediately realised what his surprise was. His book was finished. After a day's holiday, Nellie was to start reading it back to him for verbal corrections, before it would be sent off to be typed. After their day off, Nellie's work hours were increased, as listening was less taxing for Christopher, and great progress was made. However, one evening work ceased altogether when Christopher was seized with an attack of severe pain, which hot water failed to soothe. Dr. Eves was sent for and recommended an examination by X-ray. This left little doubt that his patient was suffering from malignant disease, and no doubt at all that an operation was impossible. One morning, some 6 months later, Bernard Eves had paid his daily visit to the sick room and was now giving his report to Nellie. He was telling her that all he could do was to keep Christopher free from pain as he was now, really only half conscious. Although recovery was out of the question, the doctor was surprised by the man's vitality and that he had survived summer. Nellie wondered if by now Christopher knew about their liaison, looking back and forth between the two of them, but Bernard reassured her that he was like someone half asleep, that it was utterly impossible for him to know. There was now a nurse attending Christopher who would go out for a couple of hours in the afternoon, leaving Nellie to sit with him. Usually he lay in a drugged torpor, but Nellie had instructions to give him a dose from an opiate mixture if he got restless or showed signs of being in pain. One such afternoon he began muttering and turning in bed, and she went to the table where the bottle stood. There were 3 doses left in it, and she poured the whole into his glass and gave it to him. Soon he was quiet again, and she had Dr. Eves called for, whom she informed that she had given Christopher 3 doses of the opiate. Incredulous, Bernard rushed back to his surgery and returned carrying a certain apparatus and a bottle. But his efforts to revive the patient were unavailing, and when the nurse returned, Christopher Mostyn was deceased, and in the opiate bottle were 3 doses. With Christopher's final demise attributed to an expected sudden collapse, Nellie returned from his funeral feeling no remorse or regret, but that she had freed her husband from further days of drug discomfort. Bernard had given the cause of death as malignant disease followed by heart failure, and had been wise in filling up the bottle to the same level it had been when the nurse went out. Nellie and Bernard would have to wait some months, she supposed, possibly a year, before they married. He was away visiting his own mother, who was unwell. As Nellie sat peacefully, she heard the sound of an electric bell, and when asked, the maid said that it had come from Christopher's study, and she'd assumed that Nellie was in there. As it was nearly dark, Nellie turned to switch on the light, to hear a creak from the old rocking chair where her husband had once sat over his notes. She looked and saw that the chair was oscillating slightly, as if someone had just got up from it. Thinking that her tread on a loose board had caused the movement, Nellie calmed her nerves and eventually went to bed. Opposite the door of Christopher's study, she paused and, wanting to dispel her own fear, unlocked it and entered. She was chilled to see his green-shaded reading lamp burning, and the rocking chair again oscillating to and fro, as if its invisible occupant had risen on her entry. As the spectral light faded, something stirred, and she heard the faint thud of a footfall on the carpet, pacing there and pausing in the darkness. Nellie awoke indifferent to the possibility of Christopher haunting her. It could not harm her, nor deprive her of the life and freedom which now tingled inside her. But returning from a long walk, she perceived something like a chilly mist spreading throughout the house. The door of the room where Christopher had died was open, and from the sheeted bed came the faint sound of moaning and muttering. Turning on the light, she saw that the room was empty, and on the table by the bed stood the bottle with the 3 doses of opiate mixture. She could have sworn it had been removed with all the other appliances of the sick room, but some invincible horror prevented her from now taking it away. Even her parlour-maid was looking scared and white. She had heard someone moving about in the master's study overhead, and also found the door open and shut it again before Nellie's return. Nellie's fear forced her to return to Christopher's study, where again the reading lamp was burning, and in the chair, with his literary proofs in his hand, was Christopher. He turned and looked at her, setting the chair in oscillation, and then she found herself staring into blackness. As she leaned against the wall outside, a cold wave of terror streamed over Nellie. With an encompassing presence, Christopher was now close beside her in the brightly lit passage. She heard a bell ringing somewhere in the house and wondered if he was again summoning her to read, but fled back to the sitting room. There came steps in the passage and a hand on the door, and in panic she crouched in her chair and whimpered. The door opened and Bernard stood there. He reached out for her, then withdrew his hands. She knew that he had come to say that he could not see her again, although she believed that what she had done was merciful. Nellie told Bernard about Christopher's ghost and said that his love would save her from it, that Christopher wanted to get possession of her again, but that he could not come between them if they were one. But both were now staring at a mist of filmy grey beginning to form, twining and wreathing within itself, swiftly growing more substantial and taking the form and outline of a man. Features with unseeing eyes defined themselves on the face as the transparent spectre became more solid, the mouth twitching and mumbling as if trying to speak, the hands held out. Then its solidity melted again, the weaving vapours from which it had formed grew thin and vanished, and Nellie and Bernard were left looking at each other, white and blanched, with the helpless horror that stared from their answering eyes. A couple of hours later, the chambermaid came in to tell Nellie that her dinner was ready. She was now alone in her chair by the fireplace, where a small smashed bottle lay. Nellie had decided that she could not only live without Bernard, she could also tolerate living with Christopher's harmless ghost, and perhaps one day write her own book.